Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried secrets, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. Today's story is about closed Soviet cities, places absent from maps, restricted to outsiders, and built around military work or classified research. Historians describe them as towns shaped by isolation and obfuscation. During the Soviet era, unauthorized citizens could be kept out, foreigners were barred, and even the names of some places were replaced with code numbers. In theory, they were meant to protect state secrets. In practice, that secrecy also helped bury dangerous stories. Some involved murders, some involved disappearances, and some involved deaths so thoroughly wrapped in silence that they never became criminal cases at all. What tied them together was not always the method, but the environment. Military sensitivity, restricted access, and a system that treated information as something to be controlled. One of the clearest examples is Chelyabinsk 40, the secret nuclear city later known as Ozersk. Britannica notes that the Mayak complex near Kishtim was built in the late 1940s for the Soviet atomic program, and that workers had to use the mailing address Chelyabinsk 40 instead of the real place name. In 1957, a buried tank of radioactive waste exploded after a cooling failure. The result was the Kishtim disaster. About 23,000 square kilometers of land were contaminated. More than 10,000 people were evacuated, and probably hundreds died from radiation. Yet the Soviet government did not acknowledge the disaster until 1989. That matters because a closed city was supposed to project control. Chelyabinsk 40 was not a frontier. It was one of the most guarded environments in the country. And yet, some of the dead there disappeared into classification rather than public history. The question was not only what happened inside the waste tank, it was also what happened afterward. Who was warned? Who was evacuated too late? Who got counted? And who became only part of a secret file? When historians describe closed cities as places where secrecy could erase civic reality, this is exactly the kind of case they mean. In Chelyabinsk 40, the hidden story was not a murder investigation. It was a secret city where lethal consequences were managed as state information before they were treated as public truth. A second example sits in Sverdlovsk. During the Cold War, Sverdlovsk was heavily tied to the Soviet military-industrial complex and was closed to foreigners. Inside the city's southern sector stood Compound 19, a clandestine biological facility. In April 1979, anthrax spores were released from that facility. Later investigations, including the famous study by Matthew Messelson and colleagues, concluded that the pattern of human and animal cases lined up in a narrow corridor downwind from the military site. Sources now agree that at least 68 people died, and the true number may have been higher. But the Soviet explanation for years was different. Officials blamed contaminated meat. Again, the important point is not only the deaths themselves. It is the structure around them. A militarized, partly closed city with a secret biological institute could shape the investigation before the public even understood what had happened. Doctors, pathologists, and local authorities were operating inside a system that prized secrecy over transparency. The state eventually carried out vaccinations and decontamination in the affected district, but it also kept repeating the meat story. For outsiders, the city remained hard to access. For insiders, the line between public health and state secrecy had already been crossed. In Sverdlovsk, the outbreak became another buried story, one where silence slowed clarity and made the full human toll harder to establish. There is a third layer to this story, and it reaches back before the atomic age. Historians of Soviet closed cities have argued that these places echoed features of the Gulag system, especially their isolation and their language of concealment. That connection matters in places like Norilsk. Britannica notes that Norilsk was founded in 1935 as an industrial center in the Arctic. More broadly, Britannica's history of the Gulag explains that Soviet forced labor camps imprisoned millions and killed vast numbers through harsh labor, starvation, and executions. The Gulag Online Virtual Museum describes the Norilsk Uprising as the longest and most massive protest in the history of the Gulag. That is why the darker stories of closed Soviet cities cannot be reduced to one kind of crime. In some places, the hidden violence was a conventional murder case. In others, it was a chain of deaths buried inside military secrecy. And in places shaped by forced labor and restricted access, violence could disappear into the landscape long before the public had language for it. Norilsk's importance here is not that it gives us a neat whodunit. It shows something broader, a place where coercion, isolation, and silence were built into the city's history from the start. Closed cities were not towns that happened to have a fence. They were environments where access was controlled, documents were classified, and local life was shaped by the needs of the military or strategic industry. The Cambridge History of Soviet Closed Cities describes them as places absent from maps and unknown to the public because of their role in weapons research. The University of Central Asia working paper on Soviet secret cities similarly notes that these cities were closed to foreigners and sometimes even to unauthorized Soviet citizens. When daily life is built around restricted movement and controlled information, crimes do not disappear, but accountability becomes harder. That helps explain the title of this video. Murders and secrets inside closed Soviet cities were not always hidden because there were no witnesses. They were hidden because the surrounding system was designed to absorb shock without surrendering information. A disappearance could remain local rumor. A suspicious death could be folded into medical language. A fatal accident at a military facility could be turned into an official lie. And a city built on coercion could normalize silence so deeply that even its worst episodes remained fragmented for decades. So when we talk about buried stories inside closed Soviet cities, we are talking about more than a few isolated crimes. We are talking about a whole environment. Chelyabinsk 40 showed how a secret atomic city could hide deadly contamination and delayed truth. Sverdlovsk showed how a restricted military city could turn a lethal outbreak into a long-running cover story. And the broader history linking secrecy, forced labor, and city building shows that some of these places were born out of systems where disappearance itself was part of the structure. That is why these stories still matter today. Not because every death can be neatly labeled murder, but because secrecy itself changed what could be known, investigated, or remembered. In the Soviet closed city, silence was never just the absence of information. It was part of how power worked. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.